I have a special guest. He needs no introduction. You know who he is. It's Eric Metaxas joining us. By the way, the launch of his book is Atheism Dead. A really special. I want to hear all about this, Eric. I'm somebody who loves a Christian apologetics from the time I was at an early age, whether it be C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, the influence of Josh McDowell, many others. Anything that was on the topic of atheism, I wanted to read, and so I want to dive into this. I'm really excited about it.
Well, thank you, my friend. I have to tell you, I've literally never been as excited about a book ever. I'm proud of all my books. I'm glad when they come out. I'm excited about them when they come out. But I've never been as excited about a book before it comes out, because there's stuff in this book. I almost feel funny talking about it because I think people are going to think I'm making it up. I discovered some things over the years and recently that are so crazy and so amazing. And I always think, how did I not know this before? And then I immediately think, how can I get this information to the body of Christ? This is huge information, but it kind of fits in with the theme of the book, that we're living in a secular narrative. We're living in a world that pretty much bats away evidence or information or news that doesn't comport with the secular narrative that even many Christians have bought into. We say, well, I'm privately a Christian, but we kind of buy into the secular narrative that faith is somehow at odds with science. That's nonsense, but we've intuited that, we've internalized it. The more I looked into this, the more I just thought, this is crazy, and it just has to be God's timing that he would allow some of this information to come out now, that he would bring it to my attention and allow me to write this book now. I say that, the scripture that goes along with this book is, where it says, when the enemy comes in like a flood, the Lord raises up a standard against him, the Spirit of the Lord. And I realize that everywhere we look, there's madness today. And we have to be clear, it's a secular-based madness. If you don't believe in God, then you're going to be inclined toward Marxist utopianism.
Right.
You're going to be inclined toward redefining the human person, redefining human sexuality.
That's right.
Being a sexual anarchist, as our friend David Helfenbein has put it. And that's where we are. And people are looking around and saying, this is crazy. What's happening?
Yeah.
And what's happening is not very complicated. We are seeing evil rear its head in a way that we've never seen before on this level. And almost no matter where you look. So the Lord, in the middle of that, wants to give us hope. He wants to raise up a standard, a battle flag that we can rally to. And I've come to believe that this book is part of that, to give Christians hope and joy in the midst of the madness. And so what am I talking about? Well, it was right at the beginning of COVID, I got the idea for this book. I said, I've met two people, and again, this is by the grace of God that I met them. I didn't, wasn't doing research. One of them I met in Albuquerque, a guy named Dr. Stephen Collins, an archaeologist. The other one is Dr. James Tour at Rice University in Houston. He is one of the top organic chemists in the world, probably the top nanoscientist on planet Earth. Both of them are believers, and each of them had a story to tell that when they told me the story, I just said, how come I've never heard this? How is it possible that I've never heard this? And then I realized no one's ever heard this, and maybe God wants me to publicize this information, because the Lord uses me a lot in that way. I find things and I want to tell the world, and the Lord uses me in my books. But this was really dramatic, because one was an example from biblical archaeology. Dr. Stephen Collins discovered biblical Sodom. And the more you hear about it, I can get into the details, but the more you say, this can't be. How is it possible that somebody discovered a city utterly wiped out, 1700 BC? It feels like it's in the mythic distance that nobody can go that early in Genesis and find anything. It's like saying, hey, we found the Garden of Eden. Like how far back can you go and expect to find biblical archaeology? Well, that's one story. And I said, I've got to tell the world, this is headline news. But when I met James Tour, it was very similar from a science point of view. He says that the one thing that nobody ever talks about is how did life emerge on the planet? Now, notice I didn't say evolve. We're not talking about life evolving. Life evolves into other kinds of life. Put that conversation far away. Let's just talk about scientists say 4 billion years ago on this planet, life emerged in the form of single cells. Every scientist says that's exactly what happened. We know it. So then the question is, okay, Mr. Scientist, how did that happen? No one ever talks about that. The reason they don't talk about it, Ryan, is because they're so embarrassed they have no answer. When Richard Dawkins, who is a scientist and a very outspoken atheist, when he was asked, he said, oh, we're working on that. That's like the check is in the mail, you'll get your money. The reason nobody talks about it is because, to be blunt, this is one of the mysteries that has stymied the world of science so completely that it's deeply embarrassing. But it gets even more embarrassing. Basically, well, before I get into that, I want to talk about that. But so those two stories were so amazing to me. One from the world of science, one from the world of archaeology. And I said, these are huge stories. Nobody seems to know about them. I asked all my Christian friends, nobody's heard of this stuff. And I thought, you know what? The narrative has been changing. In 1966, there was the famous Time magazine article, Is God Dead?
Right.
And it was kind of the high watermark of this idea that science is disproving God. And that narrative caught on from about that time. And so in our lifetimes, we've been operating under the secular narrative that science and faith sort of oppose each other. Science is pushing God out of the picture. It's only a matter of time. But while we were sleeping, something was going on. And through the decades, the evidence has poured in, particularly from science, but also from biblical archaeology, that precisely the opposite is true. And it's kind of like a nightmare if you're an atheist scientist. Many scientists are believers, but if you're an atheist scientist, this is a nightmare that science, which you've turned into this like idol or it's your God, is pointing to a creator God who made the universe, the God that you insisted couldn't exist. So the narrative has shifted. So I said, I think I need to tell that story, but the new title, instead of Is God Dead, is Atheism Dead? When you
Flip
look at
it
all
on
this
its head. Yeah.
From science, from archaeology, and then from history, at the first part of the book's about science, 3 different arguments. The second part of the book's all about biblical archaeology, some insane, funny stories. The third part of the book is about atheism itself and this founding myth of atheism, that science is at odds with faith. So I talk about all of that in the book, and taken all together, if you dare to look at this information, the question you're going to have to ask is atheism dead? Not is God dead? It's pretty obvious that maybe you can be an agnostic, but with all this evidence, you cannot be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And that's going to make a lot of people angry, but I dare them to look at the evidence and help me see what I'm missing. I'm sure I'm not missing anything. And I think that most of them are just going to say, I don't want to look at the evidence because you're an idiot. I hate you. You're a conservative Christian and I don't want to, whatever. So, but to go back to the science issue. So James Tour is such a genius in the world of nanoscience, okay? Just to give an example of what he does, he builds molecules in the lab. Have you ever tried to build a molecule? It's
Never.
One of the most difficult
Confess it.
possible.
Haven't done it. Yeah.
You confess. I confess that I've hardly ever tried myself. He does this successfully, and in 2006, he published a paper on one of his achievements that it's one of the most widely circulated peer-reviewed science papers ever done. He's done like 650 peer-reviewed papers. That's the level he's working on. But what he managed to do in the lab is create molecules, single molecules, that were effectively little cars. In other words, little wheels, axles, and a chassis, and a quote-unquote motor that runs with beams of light. Now that sounds insane. You can read about it yourself. You can read about it on Wikipedia. It's all over the literature. But the reason I'm telling you this is because you say, well, how small are these molecules? If you parked 50,000 of these cars side by side, it would be the width of a human hair.
Wow.
Okay? So this guy's one of the top nanoscientists, if not the top nanoscientist on the planet Earth. The reason I bring up his credentials is because he is the one that says, Eric, the people who talk about life coming out of non-life and what that takes, they can fudge it and they can fool a lot of people.
Yeah.
They can't fool me. I know exactly what they're talking about. I know what they're claiming, which they haven't done. I show them, I say, if I give you all the ingredients, if I give you everything, whatever, show me how you do it. They don't know. He says they're clueless, and then he emphasizes that word clueless, he says, because he's so angry that they are spending billions of dollars of research money trying to do something that is trying to build a ladder to the sun. Good luck. You're never going to do it. At what point do you realize this is a joke? He says now's the time. But what's interesting is he takes us back, and a lot of us will remember this. In 1952, 53, we remember this from our textbooks. A lot of us in junior high and high school, some biology teacher said, oh, there's the Urey-Miller experiment, 1952, University of Chicago. They ran some electricity through some solution that they said is kind of like what the early Earth had. So, a few simple chemicals, some water. And they said, Shazam, the electricity, which would be like lightning, created some, amino acids. We're on our way. So with the naivete and the ignorance of the early 1950s, we were able to postulate a future where we figured out how we go from amino acids to proteins and proteins to the next step, and how we get carbohydrates and sugars and whatever, and how we make the first simple life through random processes. Now, this is one of the things that the head can't take it in, because we're so used to figuring out how we might do this in a lab that we have to say, no, we're talking random processes. We're talking about sloshing puddles 4 billion years ago created these complex things. So what James Tour says is that, so there was this great hope in 1952, 53. They basically declared, we know how life came into being. We don't need God, natural processes. He says it has been 7 decades and they have not moved that ball forward 1 inch. Not only haven't they moved the ball forward, they haven't figured out the next step and the next step and the next step. On the contrary, they have gone dramatically backwards, because the more science has discovered about the process, the more science has discovered about the infinity of complexity in a cell, the more they have realized we are farther from figuring this out today than we were in 1952, when we were too ignorant to know what we were facing. So the question is not, how did life evolve? Put that to the side. Agree with people. Yeah, it evolved, whatever you want to believe. Answer me this question. How did life emerge 4 billion years ago? You're saying it didn't require God. I'm saying that the science now says it did require an intelligent designer on a level beyond our wildest imaginings. So that's just one argument. And again, I'm giving you the brushstrokes, but I devote 2 chapters to it in the book, because I said, when people read this, it's going to freak some people out. It's going to freak out some scientists. It's going to freak out some agnostics, and it's going to freak out a lot of believers who kind of bought into this lie that, oh, the natural processes could do this. I talk about the fine-tuned universe. It gets more and more crazy think of this. The more science discovers, the more it points to the idea that the world in which we live was exquisitely designed and calibrated for life on a level basically incomprehensible to our minds. But what I find ironic is that's what the science is leading us to. That's not faith. That science is pointing us to increased evidence for faith. The third thing I talk about is the Big Bang, which most of us know about, and I won't go into that. But some of that is very funny, the story of how that blew people's minds when they discovered, oh yeah, it's very similar to the biblical account. The world was created. It didn't exist forever. So
Right. That's right. Hey, there's just so many things to touch on, and this is so important. The Origin of Species comes out, 1860, I think. Darwin he really did believe that in time, science would then produce explanations for these massive gaps in evolution and evolutionary theory. Theory, people. By the way, today, everybody calls conspiracy theory. It's not a theory if it's an actual conspiracy. But with evolution, it is a theory, okay? And it is yet to be proven. The greatest scrutiny that the Bible has ever been subjected to is now, and it is yet to be disproven. And yet, flip that over, and I love what you say about this. These scientists, so cavalier, so smug, so certain, it's this kind of triumphal atheism that says, hey, guess what? We're on our way. We're well on our way to proving it. I love what you said about the check being in the mail. It's going to happen. We're right on the cusp, and yet they can't prove it. And what you're seeing in society, again, narrative. It's more narrative than it is science. Even with COVID, Eric, you and I both know it's narrative. It's not science. I love how you started out. I'm just going to quote this. This is Psalm chapter 14, verse 1. A fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are what? Corrupt. They do abominable deeds. One of the things we were talking about just a couple of days ago, atheism, so you have the scientific element, but then you have the outcome of a human philosophy which says there is no God, but let's be honest, they actually believe they themselves are God. I believe that atheists believe in a theocracy. They believe themselves to be theo. And so you create kind of an authoritarian, totalitarian government by which government becomes God, right? And it's inhabited by people.
I write about that at the end of the book. The first part of the book is all this science stuff. The second part of the book is loony stuff from biblical archaeology, which we'll get to in a minute. But the third part of the book, I look at atheism itself. In other words, we've had enough time to look at science. We've had enough time to look at biblical archaeology to say, like, hey, the evidence is dramatic. But what about atheism itself? Well, since 1859, when Darwin published his book, there's been this narrative that, oh, we're gonna figure this stuff out as time goes by. The fossil record will show it. As time goes by, we'll figure out how life emerged from the prebiotic soup. As time goes by, we'll see all this stuff. Well, time has gone by, and we now know that atheism itself has a very bad record. Atheism itself has led to some of the most demonic, murderous regimes in the history of the world. In fact, not the most, has led to the single most demonic, murderous, soul-crushing regimes in the history of the world. That's a fact. So if you're Christopher Hitchens or you're Richard Dawkins and you don't want to deal with that, you're playing head games. You're not being honest, and we should never take you seriously because you don't want to be taken seriously. You want to sell books. The reality is that the regimes that say there is no God and that enforce there's no God, think of the irony. If a country is Christian, truly Christian, it says we believe in freedom. We believe you can believe in atheism, you can believe in anything you want because the gospel cannot be compelled. So Christianity brings about freedom. When it doesn't, we condemn it. But atheism has no reason to believe in freedom. Atheism says we don't even believe human beings are made in the image of God. There is no God. So we believe that power is power. And if we have power, we can crush the individual. Guess who did that? The Nazis did that. The Uyghur Muslims are being crushed by the communist Chinese. Anybody who talks against Kim Jong-un will be destroyed. Everywhere you look in history, from the beginning of these godless regimes till the end. Then I deal with the atheists themselves. Let's look at the lives of atheists. We've seen a few come and go. Let's look at their lives. What I talk about is that the people who took atheism very seriously and honestly, people like Albert Camus, people like Jean-Paul Sartre, people like Anthony Flew, they took it so seriously, they saw the bleakness of it. They didn't shrink from it. They didn't say, hey, it's a great idea, let's sell some books. They were troubled by the idea of a world without God. They said, this is the reality, we believe there's no God, but they were troubled by it and they tried to struggle to make a moral system. How can we believe in good and evil, and how can we, they struggled with it, honestly. And here's the big news, which I get to in the book. People aren't going to believe this. I'm telling you, this is like when I discovered this, I said, I don't know how the Lord allowed me to find this, but I found it, and you can follow the footnotes and you can look it up yourself. I'm not making this up. It's real. But Camus and Sartre, both of whom were deeply committed atheists, probably the most famous atheists of the 20th century, both of them at the end of their lives saw through the bottom to the other side and became believers in God. Why doesn't everyone know that? We know that Sir Anthony Flew who was another one of the most famous atheists 20th century, he came to believe in God, but nobody ever hears about Camus or Sartre. And so I put it in the book, and it's going to blow minds. And I want to say that anybody who's honest about atheism is troubled by it. Woody Allen, the poet, Dylan Thomas, these people, they wrestle. They don't act like, hey, this is great. People who act like it's great, like Christopher Hitchens and Dawkins, they're clearly not to be taken seriously. And I take them to task in the book. I say that the ones who took it seriously, I can give them credit. But you guys, you're playing games. And some of what the New Atheist said is instantly self-contradictory. It's ridiculous. It's amazing nobody called them out on it and told them at the time, you need to sit down. You're playing games. You're not being honest. You don't seem to care about the truth. You don't even believe in the truth. Tell me, as an atheist, where do you even get the idea of truth? Tell me, what's your logical construct for believing in ethics and truth and good and arguing for what you think is right? You don't even make that case. So, you know, the book comes out at midnight tonight officially. And I'm begging everyone with no shame, please, you can pre-order it right now or at midnight tonight. October 19th is the official launch date. I want to get these pieces of information out because I think it's going to bolster the church. You're going to be shocked at how much evidence there is for what you believe and how you've lived in a world where you thought that evidence maybe didn't exist. It's astonishing because I'm just hitting the highlights. And I think it's going to give us hope that God is so real. The fact that we sometimes almost act like, well, I hope he's real. Folks, it is overwhelming. I believe the Lord led me to write this book for such a time as this. The question is not, is God dead? It really is atheism dead? We need to push our case because the facts are on our side. People are going to get very angry about this, and I want to challenge them. Don't go by your emotions. Ryan, I have to tell you, one of the biggest myths that I was astonished in this book, the myth that science and faith are at odds.
Yes.
That is, not only is that not true, but John Lennox says it is atheism that is incompatible with science. And he explains.
I wholeheartedly agree.
But it goes beyond that. Not only is faith compatible with science, what I say in the book, and I got it from, of course, people like my friend Nancy Pearcey and others and Stephen Meyer who've written about it, but they explain without any question, science, modern science as we know it, the scientific revolution, came out of Christian faith.
That's right.
Historical fact. Historical fact. So anytime anybody even suggests that faith and science are at odds, you need to look at them and say, you've got to be kidding, because science as we know it comes out of Christian faith. Read this chapter. This is not made up. And I quote many people who are not Christians who say the same thing. They say, look, historically, you don't have to like it, but this is the historical fact. And I talk about the founding myth of atheism begins with Galileo, this idea he was this brave scientist fighting against the church. That's mostly a made-up story. It is certainly mythical because at the time, there were many people like Galileo, who were the greatest scientists of their time, who were more profound Christians than their critics. They were all Christians, whether Kepler, Copernicus, Galileo, all down the line, Isaac Newton, Boyle, everybody who invented science as we know it were profound Christians. And the final thing that I always want to say is that I find it funny that Galileo tried to get people to look through his telescope, to say like, hey, don't take my word for it. Here's the telescope. You look at the evidence. They refused to look through the telescope. And I think there are going to be people that are going to refuse to read this book, refuse to discuss it, because they don't want to know. They would rather be in their little bubble, living as they've lived, because they're frightened of what the evidence shows. And so this is a moment for the church, I think, to know God is raising up a standard. He is doing things right now. I didn't come up with this idea. The Lord gave it to me. I was really amazed when it all came together. I said, I've got to write about this, and I have got to get this into the hands of believers. This is an apologetic. There's nothing political about it. It is absolute faith and science and history, and we need to know this stuff so we can stand proudly and fight more boldly in all the battles that we face.
Amen. I love it. Faith and reason are inextricably linked. We have a reasonable faith. You know, you go back, I love what you're saying about Galileo, and throughout history, we as Christians have been charged with this kind of fideism, where it's this kind of faith that is ethereal, but it's not grounded or rooted in reality. Nothing could be further from the truth. And I think what has been proven time and time again in science is that it does not refute or overturn Scripture, the Bible, the archaeology, the history. All of these things come together, and it's spooky. And if you're an atheist, you are living in a bubble. You're literally living in a bubble that you've created, your own false narrative, that you can exist without God, and a God that you're accountable to. And so, the unrighteous, they flee when no one pursues. I think it's the idea that there is somebody that we have to answer to at the end of our life. There is a judgment to come. And I think everybody needs to read your book, Eric. I think it's a reality check. It's a wake-up call to this generation. What we're seeing happening right now with our government is we're seeing a culture that has forgotten God and is taking God out of every single dialogue, every single narrative, every single news piece, education, all of it. And because of that, because we're punting on theism, you're now seeing a government who has no clue, has no moral compass, no ethics, is constantly lying. Even if you're on the left, you know you're being lied to by your own government, right? Ronald Reagan, when he was president, he was talking about the evil empire of the Soviet Union. The Soviets used to joke about the lies that their own government would tell them. This is where we've come, and I think it all points back to fundamentally, do you believe in God? I think that's it.
I begin the book with the famous Solzhenitsyn quote. He talks about the horrors, the nightmare that unfolded in Russia because of the communism.
Yeah.
And he says, all these things have happened because men have forgotten God. That is happening in America today. We need to get back to God, but don't take my word for it. The facts are the facts. God has allowed us to see the facts today. Science 50 years ago could not point dramatically to God in the way that it does today. The Lord has allowed us to use science to discover things today that argue for God's existence, so that people like Sir Anthony Flew, who dedicated his life to atheism, finally said, sorry, the science and the evidence leads in the other direction. I follow the evidence. The same thing with biblical archaeology. The stories of biblical archaeology in this book are some of my favorite stories I've ever encountered. And as you know, I'm a storyteller. So a lot of times I thought, oh, I need to kind of list some of these major archaeological finds, right? But as I kind of dug in a little bit more, I said, some of these stories of how these things were found are hilarious and insane. They're amazing stories. You'll never forget the discovery of the Moabite stone. If you take it on a test, what's the Moabite stone? It was this and this and that. When you hear the story of how it was discovered and what they went through, and it's just like an insane story. The same thing goes for a number of these other objects that were found. The stories themselves are amazing. And Rabbi Nelson Gluck, he was a very, very famous figure in the mid-20th century. Even already in the 50s, he said that no biblical reference has ever been contradicted by something that an archaeologist found. That, of course, is now, practically 70 years ago. It goes on and on and on. The more we find in the sands of the Middle East, the more it proves the historicity of the Bible. And people are being freaked out. They're being freaked out. I mentioned the discovery of biblical Sodom. It's one of the most astonishing things. An article was written in Nature. That is one of the premier scientific journals of our day. And I wrote about that in a Newsweek article you can look up. But of course, there are 2 chapters in my book that give you the details. But top scientists are facing this information, that these things happened, that King David was not mythical. We have a stele with his name. Everywhere you look, And so what I start the book by saying we are living in unprecedentedly exciting times. The problem is most of us just don't know it yet. And I wrote this book to let people know why we're living in exciting times and why we need to have profound hope that the Lord has not left us alone. We're not orphans. He's with us. He's giving us arguments and information for such a time as this. So yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited.